The emergency radio crackled to life as Marcus Thompson steered his ambulance through the congested streets of downtown Denver, the familiar weight of his paramedic badge pressing against his chest as he navigated through the late afternoon traffic. Unit 47, we have multiple casualties at the intersection of 16th and Blake, possible multi-vehicle collision with pedestrian involvement. The dispatcher's voice cut through the ambient noise of the city. Marcus had been running calls for 12 years, but something in the dispatcher's tone made his stomach tighten with an inexplicable dread. As he approached the scene, the first thing that struck him wasn't the twisted metal of the three-car pileup or the shattered glass scattered across the asphalt like deadly confetti, but the eerie silence that seemed to blanket the area despite the growing crowd of onlookers. He parked his ambulance and grabbed his medical kit, jogging toward what appeared to be the primary victim, a middle-aged businessman in a torn suit who was lying motionless near the sidewalk. But as Marcus knelt beside the man and reached for his neck to check for a pulse, the supposedly unconscious victim suddenly lurched upward with a guttural snarl that sounded nothing like human speech. His eyes rolled back to show only the whites, his skin a sickly gray pallor that Marcus had only seen on corpses in the morgue. The man's teeth, stained with something dark and viscous, snapped inches from Marcus's face as he instinctively jerked backward, his years of medical training screaming that this was impossible. Dead people don't move, don't attack, don't emit those inhuman sounds that seemed to reverberate from deep within the businessman's chest. Behind him, screams erupted from the crowd as more of the supposed accident victims began to rise, their movements jerky and unnatural, like marionettes controlled by a drunk puppeteer, and Marcus watched in horror as a woman in a bloodied yellow dress grabbed a teenage boy who had been trying to help her, sinking her teeth into his neck with a wet, tearing sound that would haunt his dreams forever. The boy's scream cut through the air like a blade as blood sprayed across the concrete, and within seconds, other bystanders were either running in panic or being dragged down by what Marcus's rational mind refused to accept were the walking dead. His emergency training kicked in as he scrambled to his feet, reaching for his radio to call for backup. But the airwaves were already chaos, multiple units reporting similar incidents across the city, dispatchers struggling to make sense of reports that sounded like scenes from a nightmare. A businessman who had been standing near the coffee shop suddenly stumbled forward, his morning latte still clutched in his hand, but his face was transforming before Marcus's eyes, the skin taking on that same deathly hue, the eyes becoming vacant and predatory. Marcus grabbed a metal clipboard from his medical kit and swung it hard against the approaching figure's head, the impact sending the man stumbling backward, but he immediately recovered and continued his advance with single-minded determination. The paramedic's ambulance keys felt slippery in his suddenly sweaty palms as he ran back to his vehicle, dodging between cars as more people in the street began to exhibit the same terrifying transformation. Some seemed to change instantly after being bitten, while others took several agonizing minutes, convulsing on the ground before rising with that same hungry, empty stare. Through his ambulance's windshield, Marcus could see smoke rising from several points across the city skyline, and the distant sound of gunfire was beginning to mix with the sirens and screams. His radio continued to emit fragments of increasingly desperate communications. Officer down at Colfax and Federal, hospital requesting immediate military assistance. Something's wrong with the patients in the ER, they're attacking the staff. As he started the engine, a small girl in a school uniform ran past his window, tears streaming down her face as she clutched a torn backpack, pursued by what had once been an elderly man but was now something else entirely, something that moved with predatory intent despite his advanced age. Marcus made a split-second decision that would define the rest of his life. Instead of trying to return to the hospital where he worked, where he was supposed to go, he turned his ambulance toward the residential areas on the outskirts of the city, driving past abandoned cars and scenes of chaos that his mind struggled to process, knowing instinctively that whatever was happening in Denver was spreading fast, and that the world he had known when he woke up that morning was already gone. Forever. Chat Control Sonnet 4. 3 days after the initial outbreak, Marcus Thompson found himself crouched behind an overturned delivery truck on the outskirts of Denver's industrial district, his paramedic uniform now torn and stained with dirt, sweat, and things he preferred not to think about, as he watched a lone figure methodically checking the perimeter of what appeared to be an abandoned warehouse complex. The figure moved with military precision, carrying what looked like a modified crowbar and wearing tactical boots that made barely a whisper against the concrete. And Marcus realized with a mixture of hope and wariness that this was the first living person he'd encountered since fleeing the city center who wasn't either screaming, running, or trying to bite someone's face off. He made the calculated decision to reveal himself, slowly standing with his hands visible and calling out in a low voice, "I'm alive and I'm not infected, watching as the figure spun around to reveal a woman in her 30s with short-cropped black hair, intelligent brown eyes that immediately assessed him for threats, and an expression that suggested she'd been making life-or-death decisions every hour for the past 72 hours. "Rebecca Martinez, former Army Corps of Engineers," she said after a tense moment, lowering her improvised weapon but not relaxing her guard. "And you look like medical personnel, which means you might actually be useful instead of just another mouth to feed." Marcus introduced himself and learned that Rebecca had been fortifying the warehouse complex since the second day of the outbreak, using her engineering knowledge to create barriers, establish sight lines, and set up what she called early warning systems, using salvaged car alarms and motion detectors from a nearby electronics store. As she led him through a carefully concealed entrance that involved crawling through a modified loading dock, Marcus was impressed by the ingenuity of her defenses. She'd created a maze-like approach that would funnel any unwanted visitors into predetermined kill zones while providing multiple escape routes for the occupants. Inside the main warehouse space, Marcus discovered they weren't alone. An elderly man with wild white hair and thick glasses was hunched over a makeshift laboratory constructed from folding tables, beakers salvaged from a nearby high school, and what appeared to be a microscope that had seen better days. Professor William Hayes, the old man introduced himself without looking up from his work, retired from the University of Colorado Epidemiology Department, and currently trying to figure out exactly what kind of biological nightmare we're dealing with. The professor explained that he'd been analyzing blood samples from both infected and uninfected individuals, using his decades of experience with viral outbreaks to piece together the mechanism of transmission, the incubation period, and most importantly, any potential weaknesses in whatever pathogen was causing the transformation. His preliminary findings were both fascinating and terrifying. The infection seemed to shut down higher brain functions while leaving basic motor skills and predatory instincts intact, and it appeared to be spread through direct fluid contact, primarily saliva, which explained the biting behavior. Rebecca had been keeping detailed logs of zombie movement patterns, noting that they seemed most active during dawn and dusk hours, moved in response to sound more than sight, and showed a disturbing tendency to gather in larger groups as time passed. Their productive planning session was interrupted by the sound of Rebecca's perimeter alarms, followed by voices, human voices, calling for help from outside the warehouse complex. Through a carefully positioned mirror system that Rebecca had rigged to provide surveillance without exposing themselves, they could see two teenagers, a boy and a girl who appeared to be siblings, supporting each other as they stumbled through the debris-strewn parking lot, the girl's left arm hanging at an unnatural angle while the boy limped heavily on what was obviously a sprained or broken ankle. Marcus's medical instincts warred with his newly developed survival paranoia as he watched the kids collapse near the outer fence, exhausted and clearly in pain, while Rebecca and the professor debated in urgent whispers whether this might be a trap, whether the teens might be infected, or whether helping them would compromise their carefully constructed sanctuary. The decision was made for them when a group of 6 zombies appeared at the far end of the parking lot, drawn by the teens' earlier calls for help, moving with that characteristic shuffling gait but displaying in coordination that hadn't been present in the early days of the outbreak. "Jake and Emma Wilson," the boy gasped when Rebecca and Marcus reached them, having made the choice to risk exposure rather than watch 2 kids get torn apart. "Our parents? They didn't make it out of the subdivision. We've been running for 2 days." As they helped the injured teenagers back to the warehouse, Marcus noticed that the zombies in the distance had stopped their direct approach and seemed to be communicating with each other through a series of low growls and gestures, a development that made Professor Hayes mutter something under his breath about adaptation and evolutionary pressure that sounded distinctly ominous. The warehouse that had felt like a temporary refuge suddenly seemed much smaller and far less secure as Marcus realized they now had 4 people to protect, limited medical supplies, and an enemy that appeared to be learning from its mistakes with each passing day. Chat controls Sonnet 4. By the end of their first week together in the warehouse, Marcus Thompson had learned to move through the abandoned streets of Denver's industrial district with the calculated precision of a predator rather than the hurried desperation of prey, his medical bag now supplemented with a tire iron and a tactical flashlight that Rebecca had taught him to use as both illumination and weapon. Their supplies were running dangerously low despite careful rationing, and Professor Hayes had developed a persistent cough that worried Marcus more than the old man was willing to admit, which meant they needed to venture beyond their secure perimeter to find both medical supplies and food for their growing group. Rebecca had spent hours studying satellite maps and city blueprints to identify potential supply sources, eventually settling on Denver General Hospital's emergency stockroom and a nearby medical supply warehouse that should contain everything from antibiotics to surgical equipment. But the mission would require traversing nearly 3 miles of zombie-infested territory during daylight hours when their enemies were most active. Jake Wilson, despite his injured ankle, had proven surprisingly adept at moving silently and had volunteered to serve as their scout, while his sister Emma remained at the warehouse to help Professor Hayes with his increasingly urgent research into the viral pathogen that continued to evolve in ways that defied conventional understanding. The trio set out before dawn, using a route that Rebecca had mapped through storm drains and maintenance tunnels, emerging 6 blocks from their target only to discover that the zombies had changed dramatically since their last reconnaissance mission. Where once the infected had wandered aimlessly in small groups, now they moved with purpose, posting what appeared to be sentries at key intersections while larger groups conducted systematic searches of buildings, and most disturbing of all, they seemed to be communicating through a complex system of grunts, clicks, and gestures that suggested a rapidly developing intelligence. Marcus watched in horrified fascination as a zombie in a torn postal uniform directed 2 others toward a collapsed storefront where survivors might be hiding, the creature's movements deliberate and strategic rather than the random shambling they had expected. The medical facility proved to be a fortress under siege, with dozens of zombies surrounding the building in a loose perimeter, but Rebecca noticed they weren't attempting to break in, instead appearing to wait with the patience of experienced hunters who knew their prey would eventually need to emerge. Using a combination of distraction tactics and Rebecca's engineering expertise, they managed to create a small explosion in a distant parking garage that drew most of the zombie horde away from the hospital, giving them a narrow window to reach the emergency entrance. Inside, they discovered the building was far from empty. Dr. Amanda Foster, our infectious disease specialist who had been trapped in the facility since the outbreak began, emerged from a barricaded laboratory with critical information about the pathogen's origin and development. Dr. Foster explained that she had been analyzing tissue samples and had discovered evidence that the infection was not a natural mutation but rather an engineered bioweapon that had somehow escaped containment, designed to create the perfect soldier by eliminating fear, pain response, and individual thought while maintaining basic motor functions and predatory instincts. Her research indicated that the virus was continuing to evolve at an unprecedented rate, with each generation of infected becoming more coordinated, more intelligent and more dangerous than the last. As they gathered medical supplies and Dr. Foster's critical research data, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the hospital corridors, but these weren't the shuffling steps of typical zombies. These moved with military precision, suggesting that some of the infected retained muscle memory from their previous lives. The team barely escaped through a service elevator shaft that Rebecca had identified as their emergency exit route, but not before witnessing something that would haunt their dreams. A zombie in military fatigues directing a coordinated assault on the hospital's main entrance, using hand signals that Marcus recognized from his emergency response training as standard tactical communication. The journey back to their warehouse sanctuary became a running battle through streets that seemed to shift and change as groups of zombies attempted to herd them toward predetermined ambush points, forcing Rebecca to abandon her carefully planned route in favor of improvised escapes through building basements and rooftop passages that Jake navigated with the fearless agility of youth. When they finally reached their warehouse after nightfall, exhausted and carrying precious medical supplies along with Dr. Foster's research, they discovered that their safe haven had been discovered. The perimeter alarms were silent, the carefully constructed barriers had been systematically dismantled rather than destroyed, and Emma Wilson sat bound and gagged in the center of the warehouse floor, her eyes wide with terror as she watched Professor Hayes being held at gunpoint by 3 men in mismatched military gear who spoke with the casual authority of people accustomed to taking whatever they wanted from those too weak to resist. Chat Control Sonnet 4. The man holding Professor Hayes at gunpoint introduced himself as Commander Jackson Wells with the kind of crisp military bearing that would have been reassuring under normal circumstances, but the cold calculation in his eyes and the way his 2 subordinates kept their weapons trained on the bound Emma Wilson made it clear that this was no rescue operation. Wells explained in a conversational tone that suggested he was accustomed to being obeyed without question that he represented what remained of organized military resistance in the Denver area, operating from a fortified compound where survivors could find safety, medical care, and the protection of trained soldiers who understood how to fight the zombie threat effectively. Marcus felt his heart sink as he realized that their carefully constructed sanctuary had been under surveillance for days, that Wells and his men had been watching their movements, cataloging their resources, and waiting for the perfect moment to assert control over what they had built through desperate ingenuity and mutual trust. Rebecca's engineering expertise, Professor Hayes' scientific knowledge, Dr. Foster's research into the viral outbreak, and even Marcus's medical training were all valuable assets that Wells intended to conscript for his own purposes. but the commander's casual mention of recruitment protocols and resource optimization carried undertones that made Marcus's skin crawl with the memory of authoritarian regimes he'd studied in history books. Dr. Foster stepped forward with her research data clutched protectively against her chest, demanding to know what Wells intended to do with her findings about the engineered nature of the virus, only to be told that such information was now classified and would be used to develop countermeasures that served the military's strategic objectives rather than the broader goal of saving civilian lives. The commander's proposal was presented as a generous offer that they would be foolish to refuse: accompany his team to the military compound where they would be given comfortable quarters, adequate food, and the opportunity to contribute their skills to humanity's survival, or remain in their warehouse to face the increasingly intelligent zombie hordes alone and unprotected. Jake Wilson, despite his injured ankle and his obvious fear for his sister's safety, surprised everyone by speaking up with a trembling but determined voice, pointing out that Wells hadn't actually asked them to join his group but had instead taken Emma hostage and was essentially demanding their compliance through threats and coercion. The teenager's defiance triggered a violent response from one of Wells's subordinates, who struck Jake across the face with enough force to send him sprawling, but the boy's courage seemed to crystallize something in the rest of the group, and Marcus found himself stepping protectively in front of the injured teenager while Rebecca moved to a position where she could potentially reach one of her hidden weapons. Professor Hayes, his hands still raised under the commander's gun, began speaking in a calm, measured tone about the ethical implications of using scientific research for military purposes rather than humanitarian ones, explaining that the viral outbreak represented an existential threat to all of humanity that could only be addressed through international cooperation and shared knowledge. Wells's response was to order his men to prepare Jake Wilson for what he euphemistically called a demonstration of consequences, dragging the struggling teenager toward a section of the warehouse where the sound of approaching zombies could be heard scratching at the exterior walls, their movements no longer random but coordinated in response to some unseen signal. The commander explained with chilling matter-of-factness that he had been using survivors as bait to study zombie behavior patterns, learning how to predict and manipulate the creature's movements for tactical advantage, and that Jake's sacrifice would provide valuable data while also serving as an object lesson about the price of defying military authority. Professor Hayes made his decision in that moment, lunging forward despite his age and frailty to tackle Commander Wells, shouting for the others to run as his body absorbed the impact of the gunshot that had been intended for Jake Wilson. The chaos that followed became a blur of violence and desperation as Rebecca used explosives she had hidden throughout the warehouse to create confusion and cover, while Marcus grabbed Jake and Dr. Foster's research data, and Emma broke free from her bonds to help her injured brother. In the smoke and darkness that followed Rebecca's diversionary explosions, they could hear Professor Hayes calling out scientific observations about viral mutation rates and transmission vectors, his voice growing weaker but maintaining the precise diction of a scholar even as he lay dying, determined to pass on every piece of knowledge that might help humanity survive the crisis he would not live to see resolved. The group escaped through Rebecca's emergency tunnels as the warehouse burned behind them, carrying the professor's sacrifice in their hearts along with the terrible knowledge that humanity's greatest enemy might not be the zombies after all, but rather the people who would exploit any crisis to seize power and control over others, regardless of the cost in innocent lives or the broader implications for species survival. Chat controls Sonnet 4. The Denver underground tunnel system had become a labyrinthine refuge for the desperate and the clever, and Marcus Thompson found himself following Rebecca Martinez through maintenance corridors that smelled of rust and decades of urban decay, their small group of survivors moving like ghosts through passages that most city dwellers had never known existed. Dr. Amanda Foster clutched her precious research data while helping Jake Wilson navigate the uneven concrete floors with his still healing ankle, and Emma Wilson brought up the rear with a determination that reminded Marcus painfully of her late friend Professor Hayes, whose final sacrifice continued to echo in their minds as they descended deeper into the city's forgotten infrastructure. The tunnels had been carved out over decades by subway construction, utility maintenance, and stormwater management, creating a three-dimensional maze that extended for miles beneath Denver streets, and Rebecca's engineering background helped her interpret the faded blueprints and maintenance markers that guided them toward what she hoped would be safety. After hours of careful navigation through passages barely wide enough for a single person, they emerged into a massive central chamber that had once served as a subway junction before the project was abandoned in the 1980s, only to discover that they were not the first survivors to recognize the underground's potential as a sanctuary. Tony Rodriguez, a stocky man in his 50s wearing a modified transit authority uniform, greeted them with a combination of wariness and desperate hope, explaining that he had been a subway maintenance supervisor before the outbreak and now served as the unofficial leader of nearly 40 survivors who had transformed the abandoned station into a functioning community. The underground settlement was a marvel of improvised engineering and human adaptability, with sleeping areas carved out of side tunnels, a communal kitchen powered by salvage generators, workshops where people repaired equipment and weapons, and even a small medical bay where Dr. Foster's expertise was immediately welcomed by the community's overwhelmed volunteer medic. Tony explained that the tunnels provided natural defenses against zombie incursions, with narrow choke points that could be easily defended and multiple escape routes that allowed the community to relocate quickly if any section became compromised, but he also warned that their underground paradise was not as secure as it appeared. The zombies had been evolving faster than anyone anticipated, developing an ability to navigate in complete darkness and showing a disturbing tendency to explore underground spaces with the same systematic thoroughness they had begun displaying above ground, and several outer sections of the tunnel network had already been abandoned after zombie infiltration made them too dangerous to occupy. Marcus found himself working alongside the community's existing medical team to treat injuries and illnesses that ranged from infected wounds to malnutrition, while Rebecca began collaborating with Tony and several other technically skilled survivors to improve the settlement's defenses and infrastructure. Dr. Foster established a makeshift laboratory where she could continue her viral research with the help of a former graduate student named Kevin Murphy, who had been studying biochemistry before the world ended and proved remarkably adept at improvising scientific equipment from salvaged materials. Jake and Emma Wilson quickly integrated into the community's younger members, with Jake helping to maintain the settlement's early warning systems despite his mobility limitations, and Emma proving to have an unexpected talent for organizing supply inventories and rationing systems that kept the group fed and equipped. The relative peace of their first week underground was shattered when a section of tunnel collapsed during a violent thunderstorm, trapping 8 people in a rapidly flooding chamber while simultaneously opening a breach that allowed zombies to enter the settlement's previously secure perimeter. The disaster presented an impossible choice between the certain safety of the remaining community members and the probable death of anyone who attempted a rescue in the flooded, zombie-infested tunnels, but Marcus found himself unable to abandon people who needed medical attention, just as he had been unable to ignore his calling during the initial outbreak in Denver streets. Tony Rodriguez faced a leadership crisis as community members argued about whether to risk everything for 8 trapped survivors or to seal the breach and write off the victims as an acceptable loss, while the sound of zombie movements echoed through passages that had once seemed impregnable, and the storm water continued to rise in sections of the tunnel system that had never been designed to handle the volume of runoff from the city's overwhelmed drainage infrastructure. Rebecca worked frantically with a team of volunteers to devise a rescue plan that might save the trapped survivors without exposing the entire community to zombie attack, using her engineering knowledge to calculate water flow rates, structural stability, and the time constraints imposed by both rising water levels and the approaching zombie horde. As Marcus prepared his medical equipment for what would certainly be a dangerous rescue mission, he realized that the underground community represented something precious and fragile, a glimpse of humanity's potential to cooperate and care for one another even in the darkest circumstances, and that preserving that hope might be worth any personal risk, even if it meant venturing into flooded tunnels where zombies waited in the darkness and time was running out for 8 people whose only crime had been seeking safety in a world gone mad. Chat controls Sonnet 4. The rescue mission in the flooded tunnels had cost them 3 good people and nearly claimed Marcus Thompson's life when a zombie had grabbed his ankle in the dark water, but they had managed to save 6 of the 8 trapped survivors, and Dr. Amanda Foster's analysis of tissue samples recovered from the underground creatures revealed a disturbing breakthrough that changed everything they thought they knew about the viral outbreak. The zombies that had infiltrated the tunnel system showed genetic markers that could only have come from a laboratory environment, with viral sequences that matched no known pathogen in nature, and Foster's research pointed to a specific source: Meridian Pharmaceuticals, a biotech company located in Denver's research corridor that had been conducting classified government contracts related to biological warfare countermeasures. Rebecca Martinez used her military contacts and engineering databases to locate the facility's blueprints, discovering that Meridian's main laboratory was housed in a fortified complex designed to contain the most dangerous biological agents. But the same security features that had been meant to keep deadly pathogens inside would now make it nearly impossible for their small team to infiltrate and gather the evidence they needed to understand how the outbreak had begun. Tony Rodriguez volunteered to lead a diversionary assault with several of his most experienced tunnel fighters, drawing zombie attention away from the laboratory while Marcus, Rebecca, Dr. Foster, and Jake Wilson attempted to penetrate the facility through its underground utility connections. But the plan required them to traverse nearly 2 miles of surface territory where the evolved zombies had established what appeared to be organized patrol patterns. The journey to Meridian Pharmaceuticals became a nightmare of careful timing and desperate improvisation as they discovered that the zombies were no longer simply wandering predators but had developed a complex social structure with specialized roles, including scouts that could communicate the location of living humans across vast distances using a system of calls and gestures that resembled nothing so much as military field communications. Jake Wilson proved invaluable as their advanced scout, his youth and agility allowing him to move through the urban wasteland with remarkable stealth, but even he was shaken by what they observed when they finally reached the laboratory complex. Hundreds of zombies arranged in precise formations around the building, standing motionless like an army awaiting orders, their behavior so organized and purposeful that it challenged every assumption about the mindless nature of the infected. The facility's exterior showed signs of a violent breach that had occurred weeks earlier, with blast damage that suggested explosives had been used to escape from the inside rather than to break in from outside, and Dr. Foster's growing dread was confirmed when they discovered that the laboratory's main entrance had been welded shut from within, as if the surviving scientists had tried to contain something that had already escaped. Using Rebecca's engineering expertise and a maintenance tunnel that Jake had located during their reconnaissance, they managed to enter the building through its basement level, only to find themselves in a sterile environment where emergency lighting cast eerie shadows across laboratory equipment that looked like it belonged in a science fiction nightmare rather than a legitimate research facility. The first scientist they encountered was Dr. Elena Vasquez, a molecular biologist who had been living in a sealed clean room for over a month, surviving on emergency rations while continuing her work on what she called the Antidote Project, and her explanation of the viral outbreak's true origin was more terrifying than any of them had imagined. Meridian Pharmaceuticals had been developing a bioweapon designed to create the perfect soldier by eliminating fear responses and enhancing aggressive instincts, but the pathogen had mutated beyond their control, escaping containment when infected test subjects had broken out of their isolation chambers and attacked the research staff. Dr. Vasquez had been working frantically to develop a cure, but her research required access to the facility's main computer servers, which were located in a section of the building that had become overrun with what she called alpha zombies. Infected individuals who retained significant cognitive function while gaining enhanced physical capabilities and an apparent ability to coordinate the behavior of lesser infected through some form of biological communication network. As alarms began sounding throughout the facility and the organized zombie formations outside started moving toward the building in response to their presence, Marcus realized that they had found the source of humanity's nightmare but had also walked into a trap that might prevent them from ever sharing that knowledge with the outside world. While somewhere in the facility's secure levels, the alpha zombies were already organizing a response that would test every survival skill they had learned. In their desperate weeks since the outbreak began, Chat controls Sonnet 4. Dr. Elena Vasquez led them through the facility's maze-like corridors toward the main server room, her hands shaking not from fear but from the exhaustion of weeks spent in isolation working on what might be humanity's only hope for survival. While Marcus Thompson found himself constantly checking over his shoulder for signs of the alpha zombies that seemed to move through the building with the calculated precision of apex predators who understood their environment better than their prey. The cure formula existed in fragments across multiple computer systems, a deliberate security measure designed to prevent any single person from accessing the complete data. But Dr. Vasquez had spent her month-long imprisonment mapping the facility's network architecture and developing a plan to compile the scattered information into a transmittable package that could be broadcast to research facilities worldwide. Rebecca Martinez worked with Jake Wilson to establish defensive positions throughout their route, using her military engineering expertise to create choke points and fallback positions, while Dr. Foster helped Vasquez navigate the complex scientific databases that contained decades of bioweapons research along with the crucial antiviral formulations they desperately needed. The alpha zombies proved to be everything Dr. Vasquez had warned them about and worse, moving through the facility's ventilation systems and maintenance passages with an intelligence that seemed to anticipate their every move, coordinating attacks that forced the survivors to abandon carefully planned routes in favor of desperate improvisation that left them increasingly isolated in the building's upper levels. When they finally reached the communication center that housed the facility's satellite uplink equipment, they discovered that Commander Jackson Wells and his military unit had arrived with the same objective, having tracked them through methods that suggested either sophisticated surveillance equipment or information provided by someone who knew their destination. Wells had brought nearly 20 armed soldiers along with several survivors who appeared to be working under duress, and his intention was not to broadcast the cure formula to the world but rather to secure it for exclusive military use, creating a scenario where the antidote would become a weapon of control rather than salvation. The confrontation that erupted in the communications center became a three-way battle that would have been chaos under any circumstances, but the presence of alpha zombies who seemed to view the conflict as an opportunity rather than a threat transformed the situation into something approaching nightmare fuel, as the infected creatures began systematically eliminating combatants from all sides while working toward some objective that only they understood. Marcus found himself fighting alongside Rebecca and Dr. Vasquez to protect the computer terminals where Dr. Foster was frantically uploading the cure formula to every available satellite link, while Jake Wilson used his knowledge of the facility's layout to guide civilian survivors toward emergency exits that might or might not still be accessible. Commander Wells's strategic mistake was assuming that his military training and superior firepower would give him an advantage in close-quarters combat against opponents who felt no pain, feared no death, and coordinated their attacks with the efficiency of a hive mind, and his forces began taking casualties at an alarming rate as alpha zombies exploited every tactical weakness with an intelligence that seemed to learn from each engagement. The sound of gunfire and explosions echoed through the facility as Rebecca used her demolitions expertise to collapse sections of corridor that might slow the zombie advance, while Marcus worked desperately to keep wounded survivors alive long enough for them to escape a building that was rapidly becoming a tomb for everyone trapped inside its walls. Dr. Foster's voice cut through the chaos as she announced that the cure formula had been successfully transmitted to research facilities on 3 continents, but the victory felt hollow as they realized that Wells's interference had delayed the broadcast long enough for the alpha zombies to organize a final assault that would likely kill everyone in the communications center before they could escape. The facility's emergency systems began shutting down as structural damage from the ongoing battle compromised critical systems, and Marcus made the decision to stay behind with Dr. Vasquez to ensure the continued transmission of cure data while the others escaped through an emergency elevator that Rebecca had rigged to bypass the building's lockdown protocols. As the elevator descended with Rebecca, Dr. Foster, and Jake Wilson toward what might be safety, Marcus and Dr. Vasquez worked frantically to maintain the satellite link while alpha zombies breached the communication center's final defenses, their enhanced intelligence making them far more dangerous than any enemy Marcus had faced since the outbreak began. But their commitment to transmitting humanity's salvation gave them a purpose that transcended personal survival in a moment that would determine whether civilization had a future or whether the nightmare that began in Meridian Pharmaceuticals would consume the entire world. Chat Control Sonnet 4. 6 months after the desperate transmission from Meridian Pharmaceuticals had carried Dr. Elena Vasquez's cure formula across the globe, Rebecca Martinez stood on the observation deck of what had once been Denver International Airport, now transformed into the Coordination Center for New Haven, a thriving settlement of over 3,000 survivors who had proven that humanity's capacity for rebuilding could overcome even the darkest chapters of its history. The cure had worked exactly as Dr. Vasquez had promised, not by reversing the infection in those already transformed, but by providing immunity to those not yet exposed and gradually breaking down the viral load in recently infected individuals, allowing medical teams worldwide to save millions of lives that would otherwise have been lost to the bioweapon that had escaped from Meridian's laboratories. Rebecca's engineering expertise had been instrumental in designing New Haven's defenses and infrastructure, but more importantly, the community had been built on the principles that Marcus Thompson and Professor William Hayes had died defending, that every human life had value, that knowledge should be shared for the common good, and that survival meant more than simply staying alive. Dr. Amanda Foster had established a research facility within New Haven that served as both a medical center for the settlement and a training ground for the next generation of scientists who would ensure that humanity never again faced an existential threat from biological weapons, while her continued research into the viral pathogen had led to treatments that could help even severely infected individuals recover their humanity over time. Jake Wilson, now walking without a limp and serving as New Haven's head of reconnaissance, led daily missions to locate and rescue isolated survivor groups, using the skills he had learned during their desperate weeks underground to navigate the changed landscape where zombie populations continued to decline but still posed occasional threats to unwary travelers. His sister Emma Wilson had become the settlement's logistics coordinator, her natural talent for organization having evolved into a sophisticated system for managing resources, coordinating with other survivor communities, and maintaining the complex supply chains that kept New Haven functioning as more than just a fortress but as a genuine community where children could grow up with hope for the future. Tony Rodriguez had relocated his entire underground community to New Haven, where his experience managing survivor groups made him the natural choice to serve as the settlement's civilian administrator, working alongside Rebecca and the other leaders to ensure that democratic principles guided their decision-making processes rather than the military authoritarianism that Commander Jackson Wells had represented. The radio tower that Dr. Foster and Dr. Vasquez had used to broadcast the cure formula had become the centerpiece of a global communication network that connected survivor settlements across North America, allowing communities to share resources, coordinate rescue operations, and maintain the scientific collaboration that would be essential for humanity's long-term recovery from the bioweapons disaster. Rebecca often found herself thinking about Marcus Thompson and the sacrifice he had made in those final moments at Meridian Pharmaceuticals, knowing that his decision to stay behind and ensure the cure's transmission had saved not just New Haven but countless communities around the world that might otherwise have fallen to the evolving zombie threat. The memorial garden that the settlement had established honored not just Marcus and Professor Hayes, but also Dr. Vasquez and the thousands of other heroes whose courage and sacrifice had made survival possible, serving as a reminder that civilization's greatest strength lay not in its weapons or walls but in its people's willingness to protect and care for one another. Children who had been born after the outbreak played in New Haven's parks and attended schools where they learned not just traditional subjects but also the practical skills and ethical principles that would help them build a better world than the one their parents had inherited, their laughter a testament to humanity's remarkable ability to find joy and hope even in the aftermath of unimaginable tragedy. As Rebecca watched the sun set over the settlement's expanding borders, she could see construction crews working on new housing developments, agricultural teams tending to crops that would feed thousands, and research teams preparing for expeditions to reconnect with survivor communities in distant cities, all of it proof that the human spirit could not be broken by fear, desperation, or the actions of those who would exploit crisis for personal gain. The zombie threat had not been completely eliminated, and isolated outbreaks still occurred in remote areas where the cure had not yet been distributed, but the organized hordes and alpha zombies that had once seemed unstoppable were now historical curiosities studied by researchers who worked to ensure that such bioweapons could never again threaten human civilization. New Haven represented something more valuable than mere survival. It was a demonstration that people could choose cooperation over competition, hope over despair, and community over isolation, creating a foundation for rebuilding that honored the memory of those who had died while providing a blueprint for a future where humanity's greatest achievements lay not in its capacity for destruction but in its unlimited potential for healing, growth, and mutual care. Chat controls Sonnet 4.